So yeah, as Emily said, Kirk Olson, I'm a fisheries biologist with the Wisconsin DNR out of La Crosse, Wisconsin. And so in my position here, I cover Monroe, Vernon, La Crosse, and Crawford counties, kind of the center of the Driftless area. So today I'll be talking a bit about trout conservation in the Driftless area. I'll go a little bit into the history of it. There's a really interesting backstory on kind of how the amazing resource we have today came to be. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we're facing and how we're trying to address them. So yeah, I'll just kind of dive in here. Oh, wrong keyboard. There we go. So before I get started, I'm just going to kind of give you a quick outline of where the talk is headed. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of background and history on watershed-based conservation in the Driftless area, and in particular, this part of the Driftless area is kind of the center of the Driftless area where I'm based out of. There's some interesting stories there. I'll then move on and talk a little bit about some of the kind of challenges we're trying to address, and I'll tell you a little bit about some of the work we're doing with trout habitat restoration in the face of climate change, and then finally a little bit about some work we're doing with brook trout restoration, which are our native stream trout here in Wisconsin. Okay. So the Driftless region, it's a pretty large area. It includes parts of southeastern Minnesota, northeastern Iowa, southwestern Wisconsin. This star here is the area where I'm kind of centered out of. I'm based out of La Crosse, but I cover the counties mostly to the south of me: La Crosse, Monroe, Vernon, and Crawford counties. This region is described by, this Driftless region is described by a landscape that's been formed by a couple million years of rainwater erosion. So when you look at like this LiDAR map here, you see these really well-developed drainage networks. There's very few natural lakes in this area. The landscape hasn't been shaped by glaciers like the rest of the state, so there aren't those glacial lakes that you have in the rest of the state or in the rest of the Midwest. Here, it's a really well-developed drainage network, and the lakes that are there are mostly oxbow lakes formed by meander cutoffs in rivers, so relatively small. There are a few man-made lakes in this area, but not much. And so, the landscape we have these really flat ridge tops, and about 400 or so feet down in our valleys, we often have the cold water trout streams where these valleys intersect groundwater. And with groundwater, coming into these streams, it creates ideal habitat for trout, because it creates temperature conditions that are cool enough during the summer and don't get too cold during the winter, and are stable year long. So this area, we're really blessed with some awesome trout resources, thanks to that kind of geology and topography of this area. Prior to European settlement, this area was described by the vegetation was described by kind of a mix of deciduous forest and open savanna, prairie oak savanna. And the early settlers and explorers were really, impressed by it. This quote from David Owen, state geologist at the time, I thought was pretty interesting here. I got to move this out of the way to read it, but he just was, with these oak savannas and partially forested hillsides, he said things like, it has the effect that might baffle a landscape gardener. So you can kind of, picture, what this would look like. And, at the time he saw it. So, what's interesting though, is that the climax community in this area, given the climate, is actually, deciduous forest. The reason that there were these prairies and savannas was because the Native Americans for thousands of years prior to European settlement had been maintaining this landscape with fire, to maintain, populations and to make it easier for, their movements, or to maintain, wild game populations and make it easier for them to, travel throughout the landscape. So it was a landscape that was, heavily influenced by, by man and by the actions of Native Americans to maintain that type of ecosystem. So anyway, with European settlement in the late 1800s, early 1900s, a lot of the farmers and agriculture and people, settling the land brought with them these agricultural practices from Northern Europe that worked fine there, but just really weren't well suited to the landscape here in the Driftless area that has these really steep hills, and we get these summer rain events, these summer thunderstorms that can drop an inch or so of rain in a couple hours. And so they did things like putting out their square, building their square fields and plowing directly up and down the hill slopes. They grazed up and down these forested hill slopes and didn't really exclude cattle from any, or cattle or sheep or hogs from any part of the landscape. And all these few crop rotations, all these different agricultural practices just really weren't suited for this landscape. And basically, as a result, they modified the hydrology of the area. So when it rained, the water, instead of seeping down into the ground and reaching the aquifer, most of the water just ran over the surface of the land. And there was a study in the 1950s, I think, does a pretty good job illustrating how much land use and how the land is used can change groundwater or rainwater infiltration. They saw that in these oak hillsides that weren't grazed, they could have up to 7.46 inches of rainwater infiltration per hour. When these hillsides were grazed, that was reduced to almost nothing. So you can imagine, if you apply this across the entire landscape, how when it rained, instead of that rainwater sinking down to the ground and reaching the aquifer and being slowly released in these valley bottoms, instead it ran off the surface of the land. And so what happened was just this massive amounts, you had massive amounts of erosion in the uplands and these ridge tops, and deposition in the valleys. So you can see some of these historical photos here of these gullies that were formed in a matter of a decade or so. And so, in these valleys, there were, in some places up to 10 feet of deposition. Entire towns had to be moved. This wasn't just devastating for streams. This change was devastating, for infrastructure and towns and the people living on the landscape. Farms became less productive because they're losing topsoil. And so it was all around a kind of a bad deal. People around that time in the 1930s recognized that, this was a problem. And so the Soil Conservation Service, or what's now the NRCS, developed the nation's first watershed project in the Coon Creek watershed, which is maybe 5-10 miles south of La Crosse here. And with this project, they worked with all sorts of experts in the field of conservation, including folks like Aldo Leopold, who's at UW-Madison at the time. And they developed this plan where they worked with farmers in the region. They helped them kind of plan and implement practices on their land that would basically reduce the amount of rainwater that ran over the surface of the land and increase that rainwater infiltration. So they implemented things like this contour stripping. You can see the picture on the bottom left there. That's this landscape. Now, if you look at an aerial of some of the farm fields south of La Crosse, you'll see a lot of these contour strips where they've got a mix of maybe alfalfa or hay field and then row crop, which reduces the runoff and instead increases that groundwater infiltration. A big thing, like I mentioned in the previous slide, was also most of these plans included fencing off the hillsides. These hill slopes, forested hill slopes, were really important for groundwater recharge. Their role in groundwater recharge in the landscape is outsized in comparison to their overall area that they take up. So it's really important to make sure that these hillsides were not grazed. So that was part of it. They did gully stabilization, all sorts of different practices on these farms, and it was really successful. So if you look at some of the research now, some of the papers that have been put out by hydrologists and folks who are a lot smarter than me have shown that this was really successful in pushing the hydrology of this area back to kind of what it was, a little bit closer to what it was before. So base flows, or the flow of a stream, when it's not raining, the amount of groundwater coming into the stream, those were increasing throughout the region. And the peak flows, or these flood events, have decreased at the same time. And you can look at this data yourself. There's a gauge on the Kickapoo River in Lafarge in Vernon County, and just a simple plot of the minimum mean daily discharge, or the minimum that you get in over the course of a year, the minimum mean daily discharge that you see. You can see how that's gone up just substantially over the years, from almost 60 back in the 30s to, nearly over 100 now on average. Whereas those maximum discharges have kind of attenuated, and we don't see as many of those peaks. However, in the past, 10 years or so, we've seen some pretty massive flood events, which I think are more likely attributed to changes in weather patterns than in land use changes. You can also see this change in hydrology if you look at some of the old groundwater monitoring stations in the Coon Creek watershed. So there's a couple here, and you can, on the ridge, the increase in the monitoring station there, the increase in the depth to the groundwater table has just been substantial. So those groundwater levels keep going up and up and up. That's a good thing. That means that the rainwater is, instead of running off the surface, is getting down into the aquifer. And I'm talking a lot about, hydrology for being a trout biologist, but really, what happens on the landscape and that hydrology is so critical to our trout streams in this area. And it's really, what you see in these valleys now is it's a really tight reflection of what is going on in the landscape. So you can see how things have changed in some of these photos here. From 1975 to 99, this photos from Stanley Trimble's book, how basically the base flow in this small tributary to Coon Creek, it hasn't rained. It's just the water that's coming in from the groundwater that feeds this stream, throughout the summer. You can see how much more water is in that stream. And then here on the right, I have a picture of Timber Coulee Creek near Lars Hill Road in 1919. And you can see the stream profile. It's really wide, flat, rocky, kind of looks like a gravel road. You can see, heavy grazing across the entire landscape, everything you can see in this picture, basically. The reason these streams were so wide at that time was because they were accommodating these really frequent floods. So in this part of the watershed, there's a really solid bottom on these streams, this kind of, hard pan. And so the streams can't incise, instead they get really wide. And so when you get constant floods, the stream morphology is trying to accommodate those floods. It gets really wide. And so you get these gravel road looking streams. And then on the bottom right there, cows, still on the landscape, but managed very differently. And a picture of my wife, Laurel, there fishing in Timber Coulee Creek. You can see the grazing is much different, stream much more narrow, much more adult trout habitat, better habitat overall. And yeah, kind of as I was saying there, what's interesting about this too is that, in that time frame from, the early 1900s to like 1970, after a lot of these, practices had been implemented, it wasn't that farmers totally took all livestock off the land, but they changed the way that they were grazing. And in particular, the grazed forested hillsides were greatly reduced. And those are really important areas for groundwater recharge. And so, this basically set up the trout conservation efforts in the area for success. So, these changes in hydrology made it possible for the DNR and other folks like Trout Unlimited who have done work since then for that work to actually have an effect. So beginning in the 1960s, there was some early work in this area. And then it really ramped up in the 1970s with the advent of the trout stamp, which was a dedicated funding source for trout habitat restoration. And so on some of these streams, to try to speed up their recovery, we implemented all these different practices, like installing these undercut bank structures, in different weirs. And these practices were, successful in increasing adult abundances and kind of speeding up the recovery of these streams. Another thing that the DNR and was heavily involved in was using wild trout to try to reestablish some of these populations as the hydrology of these streams improved, and this was a very successful effort. Previously a lot of domestic trout were stocked in the area, and these had kind of poor survival and low reproductive success, and so they started using some of the trout that were naturally reproducing in some of the systems in the region to reestablish populations. And these fish have much better survival. They haven't gone through generations of domestication in the hatchery, so they're better suited to living, surviving, and reproducing in a stream. So these practices were really successful in speeding up the recovery of of trout populations in this region. And, if you look at some of the old files, you can see how much things have changed from, even the 70s and 80s to now. So Timber Coulee Creek, which is one of the kind of jewels of the Coon Creek watershed, that draws a lot of anglers, a lot of people come to fish it, many people know of it. In the 50s, 60s, and 70s, it had really low density brown trout populations that were primarily supported by stocking. Now, we don't stock Timber Coulee Creek at all. It's all supported by natural reproduction, and we have densities that are extremely high, upwards of 1, 2, 3,000 fish per mile in some of these sites. We actually use Timber Coulee now as a brood source. So we during the fall months, we take a couple hundred fish from the stream, and those fish, the eggs and milk from these fish are actually used in our hatchery program to raise brown trout that are stocked in other parts of the state. So it's kind of an amazing success story how Timber Coulee, which is part of the Coon Creek watershed, has turned around. And in other parts of the region too, like the West Fork Kickapoo, you can see the changes in the trout populations there. And wherever I look in our data, it's kind of the same pattern. Where even the 90s to now, we've seen pretty good increases in both brook and brown trout, thanks to combination of those land use practices finally paying off, those improvements in land use practices, and also all the work that's been done stocking wild strain trout. And most importantly, doing habitat restoration and managing the riparian habitat. And so, all this effort has really paid off. In my area alone, Vernon, Monroe, and La Crosse and Crawford counties, the small part of the Driftless that I cover, there's now over 1,300 miles of classified trout water. And trout fishing is an important economic driver now too in the Driftless area. And they've estimated in the Driftless, which includes that entire area, and the map I had up earlier, the economic impact was estimated at $1.6 billion. So pretty substantial, economic resource that's now been developed. So it's a pretty cool kind of success story. And I just kind of wanted to give you some of the context of the Driftless area and a little bit of the history of conservation and how things have changed. It's one of those feel good stories where we've really seen just massive changes and improvements in these streams and in the fisheries that are here. And so now I'm kind of lucky coming in as a fisheries manager here, and I'm during this time when trout abundances in this area are probably as high as they've been since European settlement. So we're in the good old days right now in the Driftless area in terms of trout populations. We've seen in our data trout populations expanding upstream as there's more groundwater in some segments of headwater streams that used to run dry and now have discharge year round. And we're seeing trout populations expand downstream. So this part of the Driftless in particular is just, it's been astounding. So with all that good news, I'm now going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we face here in this part of the Driftless, and kind of how we're, what we're trying to do to manage some of that. So the next topic is going to be trout restoration in the face of climate change. So, we've seen, precipitation has increased. These flood events have become more frequent in the Driftless area. This is predicted to become worse as the years go on. By mid-century, there's going to be more of these 2-inch and greater rain events. In addition, temperatures are increasing, and that increase is predicted to continue into the future, in particular during the winter months. And to kind of to demonstrate, kind of what we've been experiencing here in my part of the Driftless area, I've got this slide here shows all of the significant flood events that were documented by the National Weather Service from 2004 to now. So, we've been hit by a lot of floods in recent years. And, it isn't something that we're, worried about in the future. It's kind of something we're dealing with right now. And I think this picture kind of captures, what we've been feeling a little bit down here with some of these floods. You've got infrastructure damaged, crops damaged, and a couple dead trout in that pool. And that's some of this is, yeah. So one of the worst floods that we've had in quite some time was this August 2018 flood. So this one, it kind of set up overnight and it just trained over the La Crosse area, just south of La Crosse area and the Coon Creek watershed, and dropped 8 to 12 inches over 24 hours. So it was a pretty significant event. We had a pressure gauge, which measures the how deep the water is at one of our on Timber Coulee Creek. And, we hadn't had it in there for many years, but there'd been several significant floods that had occurred since it was in place. We had a peak of 18 feet during the flood event. And then a few days later, another 4 inches of rain dropped and the ground was saturated, and there was another peak at 16 feet. So 2 real major flood pulses came through. And we saw, flood debris and flood damage in places that we had never seen it before. And so this was pretty significant flood. The last flood, that was this bad in the area, the locals say it was in the 1970s. But even with that 1970, that I think it was a 78 or 79 flood, they didn't have the damages that we saw with this one. So with this 2018 flood, there was also a failure of 5 dry dam structures, these PL structures, which are flood control structures in the West Fork Kickapoo watershed and the Coon Creek watershed. And so when these things failed, they sent, a ton of water, debris, logs downstream, and it really intensified the damages downstream of these. So unfortunately, with these failing, it probably even made things a little worse. So here's an image of Bohemian Valley Creek, which was kind of one of our streams that had some habitat restoration that was done in the 1960s. And so this work had held up for a really long time. The stream was in good condition, had lots of good, adult trout habitat, really popular. It'd been through many floods, but with the 2018 flood, things, all bets were off. It was, the stream jumped course in a lot of different places, cut into old floodplain terraces. And so we ended up with all these huge vertical banks, and the stream widened in a lot of places. So it was really, concerning to see this after that flood, how wide the stream had become. That it looked like, at least on the surface, that the amount of trout habitat was reduced as well from my standpoint. We also, so we assessed the damages with this flood and estimated, it was over $1 million in to basically get those segments of streams that were damaged back to what they were before, in terms of our trout habitat restoration work that we had done there. But there were some bright spots. So there were a few segments where, we had, where there was, like on the left here, these 2 pictures on the left, we got good connection to the floodplain, a really wide floodplain. And the riparian vegetation is thick and tall and managed well. In those places, in some cases, the stream thread and the stream held up pretty well. It moved, in some places, but in general, it wasn't bouncing all over the place and causing a bunch of damage. On the other hand, in the places where we had, moderate grazing or moderate or heavy grazing, or, like where it was developed, like along this golf course here, the stream bounced all over the place and changed a lot. So there were some bright spots in that, we could see, if you have the right conditions, the adult habitat in the stream can persist after a major flood like this. So what about the trout? So we did have the chance to, so we surveyed a few sites on Timber Coulee Creek. Just so happened that we surveyed them not too long before that 2018 flood. And so we were able to resample after that flood occurred. And there really wasn't much of a change in trout abundance. So trout densities were pretty much flat in terms of adult trout numbers. And probably the timing of this flood, it was August 28th, was probably good, because at that time, so brown trout are fall spawners. They're young in August, are 4.5, 5 inches long, and so they're pretty mobile and able to hunker down and avoid some of these floods without getting displaced or sent downstream to some unfavorable habitat downstream. So we didn't see drastic changes in trout numbers right after the flood, so that was good. But the big concern was the potential loss of adult trout habitat over long term. If you lose that habitat, eventually there's only so many places for these fish to live, so their numbers are going to have to, some are going to have to die for the other, for their with that happening. So anyway, just another graph here showing some densities. We didn't see a massive dip after that 2018 flood. So then the next question was, how do we proceed? So we had all these damages, and we were trying to figure out, what's the best path forward here. With such a large, area in the Coon Creek watershed where we had done habitat work in the past, it had been really successful. We didn't want to just leave it as it was in some places because the damage was so terrible. So of course there are different options, status quo. We could, just go back and fix everything the way it was, which didn't seem like a reasonable approach given what we know about climate change and, how frequent these flood events have become. Let it be, let nature take its course in some places. That, as has kind of been our approach in certain instances where we're seeing recovery. Another option that was tossed around was, using different techniques, engineering your way out, maybe implementing some more Roskin type stuff, this quote unquote natural stream channel design stuff. But I was kind of, and another option, of course, was the lighter touch approach, which is, in my opinion, is kind of focusing on restoring stream function and not just form, basically removing some of the material that's been deposited in the floodway. A lot of times there's been historic deposition from, since European settlement in these floodways, and you can remove some of that material and increase the volume of the floodway. By doing so, when it floods, there's less power in the stream channel. And so you basically see less, that stream channel is then a little bit more stable and less dynamic. And you see some of that adult habitat persisting even after these massive floods. So some different options that, were considered, but, when it comes down to it, there are certain places where we had to, it all kind of depended on the site. So like here on Bohemian Valley Creek, the stream was, had jumped a meander bend and was cutting into this guy's, we have a fisheries easement here, but the stream was cutting into a drain field. So a septic drain field. And so, and then towards his house. And so really, the option here, you can't let things be, you got to do something, pretty serious. So, we used heavy rock, sloped, mulched and seeded. And that, in this instance, that, is kind of the approach we had to take. And so it's just another image after, before and after our work. Other cases, so here on Timber Coulee Creek, there was, the stream had moved quite a bit here too, cut into this, this pretty, cut this new steep bank. And with this one, we decided not to go quite so heavy handed. We did some soil removal, did some sloping, mulch, seed. The stream's not really threatening much here besides maybe a little bit of cornfield. It's quite a ways from the house. And so we just kind of did a little bit of shaping, a little bit of soil removal and called it a day. And then in other places, on other portions of Timber Coulee Creek, we've actually seen pretty rapid natural recovery. And so this here was a segment right after the flood in 2018. You can see, sand bottom, really wide, shallow, this vertical eroding bank. But by, you can't see because I've got all this Zoom stuff up here, but by 2020, a couple of years later, the vegetation had, just filled in and the stream had already begun to narrow. You can see, some of the habitat complexity, in this little stream thread here. It looks really great to my eyes. We've got some islands, there's some coarser substrates in here, some, gosh darn it, can't remember, watercress filling in here, some crow's foot, aquatic vegetation there. So a lot of good habitat for young of the year, adult fish. And it only took a couple of years for this segment to recover. A big reason, I think, in this case why that happened was, this section was getting grazed fairly hard in the past, not extremely hard, But after the flood, it wiped out a lot of the fences and it was decided not to graze here. And in the 2 years from 2018 to 2020, a lot of that vegetation grew in really thick along the banks, and that I think sped up some of that recovery. So it would happen pretty quickly. Another example from Timber Coulee Creek, just showing, sometimes we don't necessarily have to go in and intervene. Here it was, stream's not threatening anything. It moved a little bit, created this oxbow. But really some good habitat was created. I mean, maybe not necessarily for trout in this case, the oxbow lake, but it's important to consider other non-trout species, I guess, every once in a while too. But probably great habitat for amphibians. So yeah, with all this said, there's only so much we can do within the stream threat. I mean, that's kind of where most of our ability to make a change or to impact and to have a positive impact on the resource is in fisheries. But it's really important to focus on collaboration outside of the stream corridor, is what I'm trying to say here. So within the Driftless here, in this part of the Driftless, I showed you kind of the history and demonstrated how critical or how closely linked the conditions in the stream are to land use. And so I think the future is really going to rely on private landowners, because the vast majority of the property in this area is privately held. A lot of it's in agricultural production. So the way the land is used is really going to be key in whether or not good habitat persists into the future. And so outreach I think is going to be really important, and we try to do this collaborating with other groups like Trout Unlimited and Valley Stewardship Network. When we have the chance to go and shock some fish and show people what resource we have here, and how important the conservation practices that are being used in the landscape are to what we have in this valuable resource that we have down in these stream valleys here. So yeah, just kind of, that's always going to be an important component, and something that we're going to have to focus on. There's of course additional challenges that we're facing along with climate change and this frequent flooding. In some places we have heavy grazing increasing in some places. In some cases we have the ability to try to improve things if we have stream bank easements. In other cases we have to collaborate with other folks to try to improve those conditions. Hillside development and grazing, another concern. Building in flood prone areas, although you'd think after the 2018 flood you wouldn't see any of this, sometimes it's surprising where I see construction. And then I can't quite see my last bullet point here. Oh yeah, Wild West. Okay, Wild West flood repair. So after these floods, oftentimes we see folks decide that they want to put the stream kind of back to where they think it should go, and a lot of times that results in some pretty bad damage to the habitat conditions in the stream. So another thing that we kind of have to be aware of and keyed into. All right. So with that, I'll kind of make some overall conclusions on this portion of the talk. Flooding and temperatures are predicted, are increasing in the region and are predicted to these increases are predicted to continue. Future trout habitat restoration work is going to require new approaches and likely going to depend on the situation. Application of stream restoration technique is going to be dependent on the situation, and of course collaboration outside the stream corridor is also going to be really important. As we recognize how important land use is and how closely tied that is to conditions in the stream. One, kind of bright spot with all this is that we've seen groundwater levels continue to increase, even with these, big floods. A lot of that rainwater is getting into the aquifer, and that's increasing, our base flow in our streams and actually expanding some of our streams, upstream as those groundwater levels increase. And that's good for trout. The more groundwater we have, the better it is for trout. So now I'm going to move on to my last little portion of the talk. It'll be the shortest of the three. brook trout restoration. So as many of you are probably aware, brook trout are only native stream trout in Wisconsin. In this driftless area, in this part of the driftless area in particular, we've seen declines in brook trout in recent years, whereas brown trout numbers have been increasing and relatively stable in the past, 5 years or so. In addition to those declines that we've already seen in brook trout, unfortunately, with climate change, some work that Matt Mitro with the DNR has done is estimated that the brook trout, suitable brook trout habitat will be greatly reduced by the mid-century. So we're seeing brook trout declines. In this area, it doesn't seem to be really linked to those temperature increases, because actually we've seen groundwater levels increase so substantially that's probably offsetting temperature increases at this point. But it's predicted that in the future, eventually there will be a tipping point and that brook trout habitat is going to be reduced by 2050. So something we got to think about. And so one kind of tool that we've been looking at and using here is removing brown trout. So we know that, based on the literature, brook and brown trout, they don't have a good relationship. Browns generally outcompete brookies in most situations. Brown trout being being an introduced non-native trout originally from Europe. They do this through a variety of different ways, but ultimately, in many situations, you end up where you have the two species occurring, particularly in this part of the driftless area, you end up with brookies in the headwaters, relegated to these kind of less favorable headwater sites, whereas brown trout dominate the rest of the watershed. And so this has kind of been ongoing. There, in the 90s, there was a project on Seas Branch to remove brown trout on a segment of stream where there's a dry dam, a PL structure, which prevents fish passage back upstream. So in the 1990s on Seas Branch, which is just outside of Iroquois here, Wisconsin DNR Fisheries Management, Fisheries Research did a removal of brown trout. And since that time, there have been no brown trout in that segment. And we have some of our highest brook trout densities in the region are in this section of stream, 3,000-4,000 brook trout per mile are found in this segment of stream. It's really an exceptional stream. More recently, in 2019, we initiated a brown trout removal on Mapledale Creek, another kind of headwater stream, but it's isolated from downstream reaches by this dry dam, which is a fish passage barrier. So as we're removing brown trout from this headwater kind of portion of the watershed, they can't constantly recolonize from downstream. And so here's just a few photos of that effort. Initially we started moving fish downstream of this dam, but it kind of became clear that took a lot of effort, and the densities downstream of this dam are exceedingly high as well. So it didn't really make sense to transfer these fish downstream. And with VHS and other rules, it makes transferring these fish outside of the watershed very difficult. So we ended up donating, and more recently, we ended up donating a lot of these fish to the Anago Raptor Rehab Center, Reggie. And so they've been used to help rehabilitate some of the eagles and other raptors that end up there. And so we've seen with this removal, first year after, brook trout numbers exploded. They've remained pretty high. Brown trout that we've had to remove fewer and fewer as the years have gone on. Hopefully by 2022 in this coming field season, we'll be able to tank that spawning stock. So we'll allow brook trout to take over. So we'll see what happens, but it is a tool that we have, and it's a pretty effective one, as we've seen brown trout displacing brook trout in some places. Of course, it's one of those tools where it only really works where you have a fish passage barrier, and there's not a lot of places like that, because it's been tried in other places across the state where there's not a fish passage barrier, and as brown trout are removed, they just rapidly colonize from downstream. So and you kind of need a special situation to use that. Other things that we're thinking about in terms of brook trout management into the future here, with thinking about climate change, is trying to maintain some of these well vegetated stream corridors, particularly with these tall canopy shade trees. We know from research in other parts of the state that, the shaded stream corridors generally stay colder through the summer. So, thinking about, okay, do we start planting, some of these, cottonwood oak, along these stream corridors. So, 30 years down the line, we've got good shade. Something we're really, seriously thinking about, at least in my territory here. Another big one is protecting and enhancing areas of groundwater recharge. And this one's probably, outside of sort of, my role as a fisheries biologist, and, kind of falls into, probably other folks' territories. But it'll be important, and so that'll be probably, an outreach sort of thing. But we know these hillsides are very important areas of groundwater recharge. They play an outsized role in groundwater recharge in this entire region. So, making sure that we protect those is going to be really important in the future. Making sure that, we stick with these conservation practices that were initiated, like fencing those hillsides off from grazing. It's going to be really important, because the more groundwater we have, the more stable the temperatures will be during the summer months, which is going to be good for trout, even in the face of climate change. We can help offset some of those air temperature increases by getting more rainwater into the ground. And then the last point is just changing our stocking practices. And that's a tool that we have, and a tool that we've been employing. No longer stocking brown trout, in areas where there's brookies. And then we're also looking at, stocking wild strain brookies where, we've identified it's, mostly domestic strain population. We often with these wild strain fish, we know they've evolved and they're adapted to the conditions in the stream. So maybe introducing some of that diversity into a population that's got a lineage that's made up of domestic fish could be a benefit. So just some conclusions from that portion of the talk. Brook trout are an important part of the region's natural history and a valued sport fish. We've seen them decline, and those declines are predicted to worsen with climate change, unfortunately. But we have some tools to try to offset some of this in my area here. And, we've done some brown trout removals, which we've seen have been effective, where we have a fish passage barrier. Other things that we're, having to think about is, shade trees and protecting groundwater recharge areas. So that outreach and collaboration with other folks is going to be important in the future to try to make sure we have some, brook trout populations persisting through, in the next several decades as temperatures continue to increase. So kind of bringing it all back here, trying to wrap it all up and put a bow on it. Overall conclusions I hope that you can take home from this talk is that the history of conservation in this area is really a unique demonstration of how connected watershed land use is to stream conditions. We've seen that in the past, and we've ignored, used poor land use practices. These streams have greatly suffered, and this entire landscape has suffered. And since we've changed those, we've seen just an amazing response of these streams and these fish communities, fish populations. And it hasn't meant, totally removing agriculture from the water, from the, landscape, from the watershed. It's just meant, some changes in the way the land is used. We've got climate change, and in some places changing land use, which will be a challenge to, some of the gains that we made in the area, and fish conservation and trout conservation. And dealing with some of these is going to require unique approaches and collaboration, and likely action across the entire watershed. So I guess with that, I'll just like to thank all the folks in the La Crosse office that I work closely with: Kevin Mall, Christina Pekaczyk, Ryan Olson, and Heath Beneke, my supervisor. So if you have any questions, you can take them now, or you can send them to my email on the screen there.
Thanks, Kirk. We do indeed have a couple questions here in the chat.
Okay.
Just first of all, thank you so much for that presentation. I thought it was a really, really awesome way to tell a story. The history of the landscape throughout the 50s was really awesome. And hearing about how we're in the good old days of the trout, but also faced with climate change was a little daunting too, though, but it sounds like you guys have some good plans in place. Okay,
Thanks.
so we do have a couple questions here. The first one I got in says some water systems and species thrive on natural water level fluctuations. Do
Hmm.
trout need any sort of small scale fluctuations?
Yeah, that's a good point. So yeah, I mean, these stream fish and invertebrates are adapted to living in, evolved and adapted to living in these, constantly fluctuating conditions of, that is a stream. However, these, and then we saw that in our data too, even after that 2018 flood, the trout population, persisted. However, with that, these really significant floods becoming more frequent, like that 2018 flood. And then there was a 2008 flood before that and several in between. With those, it's not just a small change that I think with having those happen back to back, those populations just don't have time to respond, which I think in more normal climate conditions, those big floods aren't going to be happening so frequently. So those populations aren't adapted to these, really frequent flood events. So yeah, they're suited to, living in these variable conditions. But I think when we get these massive floods back to back, I think then, these critters have a harder time persisting, if that answers the question.
Yeah, I think that makes total sense.
Yeah.
Our next question that someone asked is, we're wondering if you have any thoughts on Japanese hops and other invasive species that are moving in slowly from the lower Driftless and Mississippi River.
Hmm. Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know much about Japanese hops, unfortunately, and I haven't come across much of it in the counties that I manage. And yeah, so sorry, I don't have much of an answer there for you. Japanese knotweed we've run into in some of our properties, but it hasn't, it's not at, the patches aren't at sizes, or they haven't expanded so large that they're having a major impact yet. So yeah.
Okay. Our next question is, how has farmer partnership and collaboration been? Tough or easy?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, as a, fisheries biologist, kind of, I try to take as many opportunities as I can to, kind of participate in outreach activities like this to, to work with folks, whether they be farmers or whoever is out there on the landscape, and given my, and kind of tell the story of fish conservation in the driftless. But yeah, no, overall, I mean, there's a really long and, really long relationship with the farmers in the region. And we have, the DNR has this program where we purchase fishing easements that basically, allow us also to manage riparian habitat and in-stream habitat, and allow anglers perpetual access along the stream corridor. And there are, a couple 100 miles of stream bank easement in the 4 counties that I manage. And, these are purchased from, the farmers and the local, the private landowners. And we work with them, pretty closely. Like if, the flood event happens, and like that example, the example I showed on Bohemian Valley Creek, where it was cutting towards a septic field, a drain field. I mean, there's long relationships with some of the folks who have been here much longer than I have in the DNR. That, when those things happen, we know who to call, and we can go out and help them out in the system. So I think the relationship has generally been, pretty darn good, especially with the habitat restoration end of things. I think a lot of people who have farms and who graze in the valleys, appreciate the work that we do to help try to stabilize the stream. And, it's good for them too, because it means the stream isn't bouncing around through their pasture or into their cornfield as frequently.
Great. Our next question is, can you describe the relative amounts of harvest versus catch and release? Oh, can you describe the relative amounts of harvest versus catch and release in these streams? How is harvest used as a management tool?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we've done some creel surveys recently. 2016 was the last one that we did. And so a creel survey is where we, go and survey anglers on streams in a way that allows us kind of statistical sampling design that allows us to estimate the number of fish that were harvested and the number of anglers out there and the number of fish caught and released. And we saw on, streams, Bohemian Valley Creek, which is the one I had some pictures of up previously. That stream has a kind of an experimental regulation to see if angler harvest can actually reduce densities to some extent to improve growth conditions for trout. And so we've got a 10 bag and no minimum size limit on that stream. And when we did the creel survey there, we saw that despite that very liberal harvest regulation, very few people were actually harvesting fish. There's a really strong catch and release ethic among trout anglers in this area. And so we see when we do creel surveys, like on Bohemian Valley, even though people can harvest 10 trout of any size, the harvest is generally very low. Most people catch and release. So yeah, thinking about using that to maybe manage brown trout, in a brook trout, brown trout stream. It's not like the most effective tool just because harvest is so low and catch and release is so high.
Great. Well, we have a lot of comments saying thank you. People appreciate the work you do. Great big picture look at this. And that wraps up the questions we have. So I just want to say thanks again for joining us, Kirk. And I definitely learned a lot today. I know everyone else probably did as well. And so I hope everyone has a great night. And thank you for joining us.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Emily. Thanks for having me. And yeah, it's been thanks for the opportunity.
All right. Well,
Yeah.
we'll take care and we'll see you